Good evening and welcome once again to another program of Issues in the News, where we discuss the important events that would have taken place in Guyana over the past week or so. And as is the norm, we always have a packed agenda of issues to discuss. I want to begin by welcoming our viewers who are joining us from West Coast Berbice on television. Region number 5, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. To our viewers who are joining us on television in Region 6 on the east bank of the Berbice River, New Amsterdam, Kanji, and all the way along the Quarantine Coast, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. To our viewers who are joining us on Freedom Radio from Rob Street, Georgetown, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. And last but not least, to the thousands of you who are joining us on Facebook Live across the length and breadth of Guyana, the Caribbean, North America, Europe, and further afield, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. Please press that share button on your phone, press that share button on your computer, press that share button on your laptop, on your iPad, or whatever device you're watching the program on. Share it so that all your friends and followers can join us in tonight's discussion. Kumar Singh, Manmohan Singh, Randolph Sobrian, Natasha Shivdarshan, David Singh, Rudy Jaigobin are all on. Please share with me your comments, share with me your questions so that we can have an interactive session tonight. Again, I appeal to you to press that share button on the phone, on the computer, on your laptop, or on your iPad or whatever device you're using so that all your friends and all your followers can join us in tonight's discussion. And again, remember to put your questions, put your comments in the comment section of the program so that we can engage. I want to begin by informing you that finally the Honorable Justice Sandil Kisoon has made available his judgment in the GTU case. Yesterday we received copies of the written judgment numbering 134 pages. So the way is now absolutely cleared for us to proceed with the appeal and the application for the stay of execution, which we announced will be filed. Those documents are going to be filed tomorrow at the Guyana Court of Appeal. Guyana will host during the month of July, on the 10th and the 11th of July, Guyana will host its first ever legal conference on criminal justice reform in Georgetown at the Marriott Hotel. It's a big conference. It's a conference that is being done between the government of Guyana through the agency of the Attorney General Chambers and Ministry of Legal Affairs, collaborating with the Academy of Law of the Caribbean Court of Justice. So it's a joint engagement, and it will bring together attorneys general from across the region and beyond, heads of judiciaries, judicial officers, professors of law, lawyers, director of public prosecutions, and various experts in the legal arena. It's a two-day conference, and it will involve the presentation of several papers on important issues concerning the criminal justice system, and it will also have panel discussions on the various themes that are going to be interrogated and presented upon. So it's a mega event. It's the first of its kind being held in Guyana, and we have invited the entire Caribbean, the legal fraternity in Guyana as well, and we hope to have a mega turnout. So please look forward for that event. It will take place at the Marriott Hotel in Georgetown, Guyana on the 10th and the 11th of July. So last Friday in the National Assembly, we debated a bill, a very simple amendment, which intends to change the name of Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force to the title Chief of Defense Staff. That bill was debated and passed last Friday. It's a one-word amendment. The intent is to change the title Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force to Chief of Defense Staff. The reason for the amendment is that, Chief of Defense Staff apparently in the military world is the acceptable title of the head of a defense force. So we had a misnomer in our title, it being Chief of Staff. So we changed that now to bring it in line with what is apparently the acceptable title for the person who heads the army. So we have changed it from Chief of Staff to Chief of Defense Staff. Well, I thought, and we thought on the government side, that it is an amendment that will not evoke and invoke any controversy in its debate on the floor of the Parliament. And the amendment in of itself did not generate any controversy whatsoever. In fact, the opposition fully supported the amendment, and they spoke of the need for the amendment. However, during the course of the debate, the Honorable Amanza Walton Desir veered off in her presentation and launched a malicious, unjustified, and baseless attack on the Guyana Defense Force. The honorable member, using an incident which she made reference to of the President, Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali, sharing his birthday cake, with members of the army, leading members of the army. And the photographs that she's referring to apparently showed the president cutting the cake and offering it to the various officers of the army in the command structure, senior officers, including the Chief of Staff. The honorable member interpreted that to be politicization of the Guyana Defense Force, and she launched a tirade lasting several minutes, accusing our government of attempting to politicize and control the army, accusing our government of attempting to undermine the independence of the army and of our men and women in uniform. And that is what I want to speak about tonight. I am the Secretary of the Defense Board. Under the Defense Act, the Defense Board administers the affairs of the Guyana Defense Force. As you would know, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Guyana Defense Force, and he's Chairman of the Defense Board. I am the Secretary of that Defense Board. And it is from that perspective that I would like to speak, in addition to my right to speak as a citizen. Now, I have lived my entire life in this country, and I have studied the history, in particular, of independent Guyana. There is no time in our country's history that the Guyana Defense Force is as professional as it currently is. There is no point in time in our country's history when the Guyana Police Force has been more resourced than it currently is. There is no time in our country's history, in my respectful view, that the morale of the Guyana Defense Force has been higher than it currently is. So let us look at the incident first that the honorable member interpreted and concluded as an act of politicization. It was the President's birthday, and the President invited certain senior ranks of the Guyana Defense Force in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Guyana, and shared with those members pieces of his birthday cake. He also invited those members of the force to have lunch with him. Members of the cabinet were also in that room, including yours truly. All of this was done in the office of the President. I don't know how the photographs became public, but I don't see anything wrong with the photographs being made public, as I didn't see anything wrong, and I don't see anything wrong with the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces sharing a birthday cake with members of the force. How can that be interpreted as politicization of the Defense Force? I don't know. It is not. How can that be interpreted as undermining the Guyana Defense Force? Historically, every commander of the armed forces of our country, beginning with Forbes Burnham, every commander has had engagements of an open nature, of a celebratory nature, of merriment, of a social nature with the Guyana Defense Force. They have had dinners, they have had lunches, they have had breakfasts, they have had cocktails, they have had parties, they have had a variety of social and other engagements. And commanders-in-chief and the forces that they command have that relationship anywhere in the world. Many of you may know and would have seen the United States of America visiting troops, eating with troops, socializing with troops, engaging in all manner of social activities. Can those events and those engagements be interpreted as undermining the independence of the Guyana Defense Force or the U.S. Army? Certainly not. These things happen all over the world. So I want, as Secretary of the Defense Board, to reject absolutely the allegations made by Walton this year in the Parliament in relation to the government's attempts and the President's attempts at politicizing the force and undermining the professionalism of the force. But the Honourable Member, by her allegations, has presented me with a platform to speak on politicization of the Guyana Defense Force. By her comments, by her speech, by her reckless and baseless allegations, she has provided me, as Secretary of the Defense Board, with a platform. And I will take the opportunity tonight to speak about politicization of the Guyana Defense Force. Now, as you know, the Guyana Defense Force ought to be an independent institution whose primary mandate is to defend the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state of Guyana. That is its primary mandate. And in so doing, must swear an allegiance to the Constitution of Guyana and must bear loyalty to the Constitution of Guyana. In bearing loyalty and pledging allegiance to the Constitution of Guyana, that defense force must not necessarily pledge allegiance to the government of the day. Though it must support the government of the day, its allegiance and its loyalty is not necessarily to the government of the day, but to the Constitution to which that loyalty is pledged. Now let us go back into history, because a lot of young people do not understand our history, and they don't understand the role that politics has played in our armed forces in bygone years. And that is why I want to use this platform to present to our young people a factual narrative that they may be unaware of. And it is good that we understand our history. You know, if we don't understand our history and we don't know the errors that we have made in the past, then there is every likelihood that we will repeat them. And tens of thousands of young people do not know the sordid history of politicization of the armed forces by the PNC government during the 28 years of rigged elections in this country. And that is what I want to speak about. So you would recall, and those of us, excuse me, schooled in Guyanese history would know that in 1964, coming out of the ethnic and racial riots, the PNC collated with the UF, the United Force, to form the government after the 1964 elections. After we gained independence, Burnham kicked out De Geer and many of the leaders of the United Force and took control of the government. Now, that was a coalition, so obviously, and that those 64 elections were manipulated by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States and the British government. Those are recorded facts. I don't think anyone would want to dispute them. The fear was that Dr. Chetty Jagan and the PPP were communists, and the US and the British, the US persuaded the British that they can't have a communist government. So they facilitated and fostered this coalition to oust the PPP out of office. And they formed this coalition government. Well, after independence was achieved, Burnham kicked out De Geer, and another elections were coming. That is, the 1968 elections. Burnham obviously recognized that he can't win that election, those elections. He doesn't have a coalition party. He kicked out the coalition, and it was clear, statistically and demographically and politically, that by itself, the PNC cannot win a free and fair elections in the country. So Burnham decided, and the PNC decided, along with the support of the CIA, that they will rig the 1968 elections. The mechanism that they decided to use to rig that election was the mechanism of overseas voting. So, at that time, overseas voting was permitted. So you had tens of thousands of ballots cast in places like London, in the United Kingdom in particular, and in the United States and Canada, North America. And that was the mechanism that they used to rig the elections. They fabricated votes on the ground that the persons voted in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Canada. And those were the votes that they sent. Those were the votes that they counted as votes for those elections. Granada Television did a documentary. Granada Television is a British television. They did a documentary after the 1968 elections called The Trail of the Vanishing Voter. It's on YouTube, The Trail of the Vanishing Voter. It was broadcast on the 11th of December 1968, and they did another one called The Making of a Prime Minister, broadcast on the 6th of January 1969. And in those two documentaries, lasting about an hour each, you would see the reporters going to the various addresses on the voters list in various places in London, inquiring about the persons who allegedly voted at those addresses. And thousands of those persons could not have been found. They were not at the addresses. They never lived there. In fact, one of the main address given when the reporters went to find out where that place was, it was a cemetery. So the elections were massively rigged and exposed in a very, very embarrassing and humiliating public documentary that was aired across Guyana and elsewhere. In fact, more than, I believe, more than half of the votes cast in that elections were cast outside of Guyana, using the mechanism of overseas voting. So after that humongous expose, And after the embarrassment caused by this televised documentary that was shown all over, the PNC and Burnham realized that they can't use this mechanism anymore, or they can't use it as flagrantly as they have done in coming elections. So they had to come up with a different strategy. So after the 1968 elections, the next election was the 1973 elections. So as I said, they could not have used overseas voting because that was now publicized and it was exposed. So Burnham had to find another mechanism to rig the 1973 elections. The mechanism that he chose was the use of the Guyana Defense Force. Anyone who lived through that period will tell you the role that the Army played in every election, beginning with the 1973 elections. The law then was that one had to count the votes at the place of poll. That was the law then, and then we changed it. They had changed it after the 73 elections, and we changed it back in 92 to have the votes counted at the place of poll. But in 1973, you had to count the vote at the place of poll. The Army descended. As voting was concluded, the Army descended on polling stations right across the length and breadth of Guyana and took control of the ballot boxes and took them to identified centers for counting. Not GCOM, not the Guyana Elections Commission. The Army was sent out in all its numbers with machine guns to go into the polling stations, seize the ballot boxes, and take them to centralized locations. And it is at those centralized locations that the ballot boxes were stuffed. Thousands, whole night, the soldiers voted, marking the X next to the palm tree, so that PNC could have won those elections. And the Army was used for that process and for that purpose. Many of you would have heard of the name Jagan Ramisar and Bolanath Prasad. Those were two young men. One was about 18 years and one was about in his early 20s. They were from number 64 village on the Quarantine Coast. And they attempted to prevent the soldiers from taking away the ballot boxes from a polling station at 64 village. They were PPP activists. And the Army shot them. The Army shot both of them in the presence of the public, beat up a set of other people right there, shot the two of them, threw them in the back of a pickup truck with the ballot boxes, and took them all the way to Crabwood Creek to collect more ballot boxes, to pick up more ballot boxes, while those two young men were bleeding to death at the back of that pickup. By the time they were taken to the hospital, they had bled to death. The Army, in other words, murdered those two people upon the directions of the commander-in-chief at the time, Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. And that was the PNC in government using the Army to rig elections. The older folks will tell you that ballot boxes were found floating down various rivers just after those elections. They threw away the real ballots. They threw away the real ballot boxes. And using the Army, they stuffed ballot boxes with fraudulent votes and then counted them and declared Burnham and the PNC winners of those elections by a two-thirds majority. That is what they did, using the army. Mr. David Granger was a member of the army in 1973. He has repeatedly denied that he played any role in the army. But at that time, he was already a high-ranking officer in the army. And it is difficult for anyone to believe, having regard to the militaristic and command style of the army, that he did not play a part of rigging the elections using the army as the main instrument. Let me continue. After the 1973 elections, then Burnham, after he won a two-thirds majority, felt that he was invincible. And he started to promulgate the principle of party paramountcy. What that principle means, that the party is paramount to the state. It is the most paramount organization in the superstructure of Guyana. So the army, the police force, the government, the parliament, and the judiciary all became subservient to the party because the party was the paramount institution. So the army became subject to the party. The judiciary became subject to the party. The government of the day became subject to the party. So the PNC flag was flying at Campaign Ghana. The PNC flag, not the national flag, the PNC flag was being flown on the Court of Appeal building along with the Guyana flag to tell the world that the Court of Appeal, at that time our highest court, was a party institution because they had a policy named party paramountcy. This is not propaganda. This was the national policy of the day. So the army became subject to that policy. So the army became an organ of the party. And these people are talking about politicization of the army. They made the army subservient to the party. And that is why when Mr. David Granger became the presidential candidate in 2015, he boastfully said that he was a member of the PNC for 40 years. Minus 40 years from 2015, and you will see that he was a party member while he was in the army in the 70s. In fact, he boastfully said that he was head of the ideologue section of the army. And these people have the audacity to speak about politicization of the army. I am not finished yet. I'll continue this discourse. When they, after they lost the 73 elections now, Burnham and the PNC realized that they could only keep power, they could only stay in government by force. So where would this force come from? And they began a militarization process in Guyana never seen before in this hemisphere, where they created an army, the Guyana Defense Force, they built it up. Then they had a Guyana People's Militia, another paramilitary organization. Then they had a Guyana National Service, another paramilitary organization. And then they had the Guyana Police Force. So you had a small country like Guyana with a national army, a Guyana People's Militia, a Guyana National Service, and a Guyana Police Force. We had, in our military, we had the largest military on planet Earth when compared with our population. We had the highest military presence per capita in the world at that time. Why? Because the PNC saw and realized that if they don't have force, they will not be able to maintain themselves in government. Recall, they are not winning an election, they are rigging an election. So the people are against them. How do you keep the people at bay? How do you control the people? Well, the militaristic forces of the state was used to control the people and drive fear in the people. So as part of the routine activities of the army, as part of the army formal drills, they used to have hundreds, if not thousands, of army officers and soldiers and people, militia officers and national service officers marching through the villages with their guns in their hand, marching through the Georgetown, marching along the East Coast, along West Coast, along the East Bank of the Demerara, to show the population the might of the army, to instill fear in them so that if anybody would think that they can question or challenge Burnham and the PNC, he is showing you with that display of the soldiers marching the streets and the national service workers marching the streets and the people's militia marching the streets. He's showing by evidence that any attempt will be quelled very quickly because he controls the machinery of the military and the machinery and power of the state. It was a psychological warfare that they were playing with the citizens of Guyana. Remember, at that time, Walter Rodney came up and the WPA came up in the 70s. So the political situation became a very tense one. And the army, as I said, was the main weapon, and the police force. That is why during that period, many PPP leaders, many WPA leaders were shot, were killed, were locked up. Any type of political activities, political public meetings were broken up and people were beaten. In came Rabbi Washington and the House of Israel gang to supplement the forces that I'm speaking about. Rabbi came and Burnham embraced Rabbi. Rabbi had a following of about 8,000 strong. And that they throw that also among the army and the police. And these are guys who used to walk around with wood to beat people and break up political parties and break up political public meetings and rallies. That is how they run the country, using the army and the police force. People were charged routinely for no reason at all. You can't find them. The police locked them up for weeks. People were being charged with treason. 4 from Iconi, 4 from Ahika Creek. The older folks who are listening to me will know about all these incidents. Then you have the 4 from West Coast of Demerara. You had another group from Leonora, all charged with treason. No weapon ever found. The gang from Mahika Creek were charged because they had carbon. Carbon is that thing that you used to shake long ago and used to ignite it at Diwali time or Christmas. They found them with carbon and they said that that's explosive. And so you had that period where the army and the police and House of Israel members and gangs were used as political weapons against the population. You had many people, Ohini Koama, killed. You had Joshua Ramsamy, a professor at University of Guyana, shot in open daylight. You had Father Dark. He used to write for the Catholic Standard. He was stabbed, murdered right in front of Brickdam Police Station, opposite the Home Affairs Ministry. You had Dr. Walter Rodney himself, blown to pieces by a bomb that was made in the army, put in a walkie-talkie, and given to Rodney and his brother, Donald Rodney, by a sergeant of the army named Gregory Smith. This is the army actively building a bomb, concealing it in a walkie-talkie, and handing it to the Rodney brothers that blew Walter Rodney to pieces. After the bomb exploded, the army aircraft picked Gregory Smith up and took him to Kakwani. And then another army aircraft picked him up from Kakwani and took him to French Guyana. Why French Guyana? Because we did not have, and we do not have, an extradition treaty with French Guyana. These are facts that nobody can dispute. We established the PPP government, while I was sitting Attorney General, established an independent international commission of inquiry to inquire into the death of Walter Rodney. Everyone should get a copy of that report, because that report detailed the political and social circumstances of the time, and the report interrogated the circumstances under which Rodney was killed. And the commission found, as a matter of fact, firstly, that Rodney was assassinated, and secondly, that the state of Guyana and the government of the day conspired together and were responsible for Rodney's death. The army played a significant role in that process. I'm not finished. At the hearings, and go and read the report. We have made the report public. It's online. It is in the Parliament. It is on the parliamentary website. Evidence was adduced. Evidence under oath was adduced. Soldiers went into the witness box to examine the records of cache of high-powered rifles and high-powered weapons that were given by the army to members of the YSM, the Young Socialist Movement, the youth arm of the PNC. Are you listening to me? You have sworn testimony on the record that YSM leaders, the Young Socialist Movement leaders, and they named them. Their names are there. They went to the army and they used to collect arms and ammunition, AK-47, M15, high-profile assault weapons, and accompanying ammunitions. The serial numbers are there in the record. And those very weapons turned up in the hands of bandits 2 decades later. From the PNC, those weapons reached the hands of bandits. There was a bank robbery at Rose Hall. A bank robbery at Rose Hall, and the police confronted one of the bandits and shot him to death. And the AK-47 that the bandit had was the very weapon that the army gave to the YSM, gave to the PNC. How did the weapon move from the hand of the PNC to the bandits. These are facts that are on the record of an international commission of inquiry. I have the names of the persons who sat on that commission. Sir Richard Cheltenham of Barbados, Sinat Jairam, Senior Counsel of Trinidad and Tobago, and Jacqueline Samuels Brown, Queen's Counsel of Jamaica. Sinat Jairam is a Guyanese, but he lived his entire life out of Guyana. Richard Cheltenham is Bajan, and Jacqueline Samuels Brown is a Jamaican, not Guyanese. And these people sat and they heard the commission, they conducted a commission of inquiry. When they won the elections in 2015, they shut down this commission. They shut it down because they didn't want the report to come out. And the people, however, were still able to produce a report. They tried to duck the report. But we made the report public when we got back into government. That is why when you look at when they leave the army, they go straight to the PNC. So you had Collins, who was a former chief of staff of the Guyana Defense Force. When he left, he went straight over to the PNC. He was a candidate for them at elections. Rear Admiral Gary Best left the army as chief of staff. Which party did he go to? Straight to the PNC. Winston Felix was commissioner of police. Which party did he go to? PNC. You ever heard of any army chief left and come over to the PPP? Mark Phillips, he has no connection to politics. He came as a prime ministerial candidate. But Felix, Best, Collins, they were all members of the PNC all the time, just as Granger was, as he admitted that he was there for 40 years. The police force was no different. That is why Silal Prasad in his book, his biography, his autobiography, wrote that as a young constable, when he was at training school at Ivleri, at the 1985 elections, the senior officer escorted him to the polling booth and instructed him to vote for the PNC. And he had to show the officer that he actually voted for the PNC before he put the ballot in the box. That is what they did to the army and the police force of this country. And they are talking about politicizing of army and police force. Because the president gave soldiers a piece of his cake, his birthday cake, that is politicization. You hear what I just explained to you over the past 40 minutes? Compare that to a president standing in front of his entire cabinet and sharing a piece of birthday cake with soldiers. That is politicization. Burnham used to wear the military fatigue. Burnham used to dress like a major general with all the military fatigue and walk around this country. There are certain things that these people must never speak about. That is why they don't want people to talk about their history. When they're listening to me, they want to know why I'm going back. I am going back because that is our history, and that is their history. And up to now, they're still pledging loyalty to Forbes Burnham. And that is what Forbes Burnham did to this country, did to the institutions of this country. I can even recite the conversation that Winston Felix had with Basil Williams on the telephone. Winston Felix was a sitting commissioner of police. And there was a massacre going on in Agricola. And there was a taped conversation between Basil Williams, who was then an MP for the PPP, for the PNC, and Winston Felix, who was a sitting commissioner of police. And Winston Felix is heard telling Basil Williams, I had to help you out there, boy. I had to help you out. I had to divert the police. I had to send them men up the Mohabir River to look for some fuel smuggling boat. Imagine the commissioner of police, the police going to a crime scene where a massacre is going on with Feynman and his gang at Agricola. And the commissioner of police is caught on the telephone telling an MP from the opposition, I had to help you out there. I diverted the police away from the crime scene and sent them to look for some boat smuggling fuel up the Demerara River. And that very Felix, that same Winston Felix, they brought and make a minister. They made him Minister of Citizenship. And these people want to talk about politicization. Politicization. We have never had the type of vulgarity anywhere else in the Caribbean as what the PNC did to state institutions of this country. State institutions, to degut them of professionalism, to degut them of independence, to degut them from any form of morality, and to make them political weapons and stooges. That is what they did. For decades, they did that to the armed forces of this country and to many, many institutions of state. And that is why we have never really recovered from these excesses. That is why half of this country living overseas. That is what they get away from. That is what they fled from, because they were held as prisoners in their own land by an illegal government using the army and the police and the other military forces to drive fear into them. Those of you who are listening to me in New York and in Canada, you can relate to what I'm saying, especially the older ones. The younger ones, after listening to this program, go and read and go and ask your parents and your grandparents, and let them tell you what we endured in this country at the hands of the PNC. And today, with a straight face, this woman can stand in the parliament of our country and with sheer hypocrisy pretend to be offended by politicization. What she described as politicization, and she's standing on the platform of a PNC, of a party named the PNC. And she's contesting for leadership of the party. There's a caliber of leaders that you will have in that party. So I thought that I will spend some time tonight dealing with this issue of who politicized our armed forces, and in particular our army. What I have given you there is just a synopsis. There is so much more out there, but we have to have this discussion. Unless we have this discussion, then our young people will forget this history. And you will have people like Amanza Desir speaking, and they will be speaking to an audience who do not know the history and who do not know their own history, Desir's history and the history of the PNC. That is why I said tonight I want to take some time and deal with this issue. So I want to thank you. I think I've said a mouthful there. I know I've brought a lot of memories to people, brought back some of the vicious old days, but sometimes it is necessary for us to have these discussions, especially when you have people constantly trying to rewrite the history of our country. We have to be vigilant and ensure that whenever these things happen, we must put them down. And I haven't spoken about the assassination of Vincentica, which allegedly took place right at Kampayengana. Vincentica is sitting Minister of Education who was killed in a vehicle parked at Kampayengana. I haven't dealt with that incident yet. There is so much that we can discuss. But I'm happy ever so often that the PNC would want to bring these things up because it gives us a platform to respond. This weekend, on Sunday, the 26th of May, we will be celebrating our independence anniversary, and I may not be able to speak to you. I will not be able to speak to you. Before that, I want to take this opportunity to extend independence greetings to all of you. Independence is a very important event in the life of any country, and we are celebrating ours on the 26th of this month as we gained independence from Great Britain in 1966 on the 26th of May. So please enjoy the rest of the evening, enjoy the rest of the week, and happy Independence Anniversary. Thank you very much. Thank you.